America's steel industry has always been a symbol of industrial strength, gritty, loud, proud. But over the past few years, something unexpected has happened. While the United States tried to prop up its aging metal industries with sweeping tariffs and protectionist policies, Canada quietly made a move. Not louder, but smarter. And now, while American steel struggles to recover from the shockwaves of its own economic decisions, Canada is steadily stepping into the lead. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next. And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. It started with the tariffs. The United States, in a high-profile effort to protect domestic steel and aluminum production, introduced 50% tariffs on imported steel and a 35% tariff specifically on Canadian metals. The idea was simple: give American producers an edge by raising the cost of foreign competition. But what actually happened was far from the plan. Supply chains froze almost overnight. Detroit, long dependent on a mix of domestic and Canadian steel, got hit hard. Factories couldn't get the raw materials they needed. Prices surged. Inventories collapsed. In aluminum markets, the situation was even worse. Inventories of key inputs disappeared entirely. 125 tons gone, while costs soared by more than 70%. U.S. aluminum became some of the most expensive in the world. The tariffs didn't just squeeze foreign competition, they strangled U.S. manufacturers. Auto plants paused production. Small businesses shut down. And end consumers pay the price in higher costs across everything from vehicles to appliances. It was a textbook example of a protectionist policy backfiring. Instead of shielding industry, it exposed its dependencies. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada responded with focus and speed. These green metals didn't just meet domestic goals, they aligned perfectly with global standards, especially Europe's CBAM regulations. Suddenly, Canadian metals had a premium advantage in international markets. They weren't just cleaner, they were strategically valuable. At the same time, Canada began shifting its trade focus. It diversified exports away from the US, toward Europe, Asia, and other emerging markets. New tariffs were placed on Chinese steel. Quotas were introduced. Origin standards were tightened. The message was clear: Canada would protect its market strategically, not reactively. Where the US responded with walls, Canada responded with redesign. It leaned into the environmental direction the global economy is already moving toward. It aligned with Europe's carbon-focused import policies before they were enforced. And it positioned itself as a stable, compliant, and forward-thinking supplier at a time when industrial nations are rethinking their sourcing models. Canada's decarbonized metals didn't just meet environmental benchmarks, they opened doors. European buyers, facing carbon adjustment mechanisms, began looking for suppliers who wouldn't get penalized. Canadian metals, produced with lower emissions through hydroelectric power, were suddenly more attractive than cheaper but dirtier alternatives from elsewhere. That shifted leverage. It created pricing power. It helped secure long-term contracts. This wasn't a short-term win. It was a structural shift. America's decision to protect its industry with tariffs made short-term headlines. But the unintended consequence was pushing allies like Canada to seek new paths. And those paths are now reshaping the geopolitical map of industrial trade. While the U.S. saw tariffs as a way to assert dominance, Canada turned the moment into an opportunity to build future-proof capacity. And that raises a bigger question: was this a one-time shakeup, or the start of a long-term realignment? Look at the moves Canada has made. Infrastructure upgrades, procurement strategies that favor low-carbon materials, trade diversification, strategic environmental positioning. It's not reaction, it's reconstruction. Canada is laying down the framework for the next industrial age, one where green metals aren't a bonus, they're the baseline. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers continue to wrestle with high input costs. Auto plants that rely on steel and aluminum are still exposed to market volatility. And despite the tariffs, the domestic steel industry hasn't roared back, it's limping along, squeezed between higher production costs and foreign buyers who found more reliable partners elsewhere. And those tariffs? They may have protected some jobs temporarily, but they created new vulnerabilities: supply shocks, layoffs, higher consumer prices, and diminished global competitiveness. Trade policy is never just about economics. It's about strategy. And when one country chooses walls while another builds bridges, the long-term advantage shifts. Canada's metals now fit into a larger pattern, a country aligning itself not just with global markets, but with future markets. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. A nation building an industrial identity around clean production, stable partnerships, and flexible trade policy. This is the evolution of soft power, shaped not by sanctions or loud policy declarations, but by quiet consistency. And in that quiet, Canada has emerged as a major player in the steel and aluminum space. Not by outproducing the US, but by outpositioning it. Now, the broader industrial map is being redrawn. Low-carbon materials are becoming gatekeepers. Countries that can't meet the standards are losing access. And those that can, they're not just winning contracts, they're setting the terms. That's what makes this moment significant. It's not just a shift in supply chains. It's a redefinition of industrial leadership in North America. America's steel meltdown didn't just hurt its factories. It opened the door for Canada to lead a new industrial narrative, one that's less about volume and more about values, less about walls and more about standards, less about holding ground and more about building the next one. So, where does this leave the US? Still in the game, still an industrial giant, but at a crossroads. It can keep pushing protectionism or it can adapt. The global market is making its priorities clear: sustainability, resilience, and alignment with stricter environmental norms. Canada saw that writing on the wall and moved quickly. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beneath the surface of North American steel and aluminum trade, hit like. Share this with someone who follows trade policy or industrial strategy. Subscribe for more analysis on how economic decisions shape the real world. And drop a comment. Is Canada's rise just a moment? Or is the US falling behind for good? Because sometimes the loudest policies don't shape the future, the quiet ones do. And now, we're in it, the aftermath of America's steel gamble, where one nation's effort to shield itself ended up triggering a quiet transformation in another. What started as a bold move to protect domestic industry has unfolded into something bigger, a shift in North America's industrial power map, and it's tilting north. The US tariffs were supposed to spark a revival, a hard reset, a way to bring American steel back from the brink. But tariffs don't operate in a vacuum. They aren't just numbers on imports, they're shockwaves. And what they hit hardest wasn't foreign competitors. It was the American supply chain. When 50% tariffs slammed into imported steel, and 35% landed on Canadian metal, the effect wasn't just on balance sheets, it was felt in factories, loading docks, and assembly lines. American manufacturers, especially in automotive hubs like Detroit, didn't get stronger. They got squeezed. Supply dried up. Prices exploded. Inventories collapsed. And when aluminum inventories in the US market hit zero, it wasn't just an economic footnote, it was a flashing red warning light. Suddenly, American manufacturers were scrambling to find material, paying 70% more for aluminum than global averages, and trying to explain to workers why production lines were stalling. This wasn't theory, it was reality. And it was brutal. Factories shut down. Layoffs followed. Small suppliers, the backbone of US manufacturing, couldn't absorb the cost spikes. And all of it came under the weight of a policy that was supposed to help them. Meanwhile, Canada took a different path. No shouting, no headlines, no political chest-pounding, just action. Ottawa launched a $1 billion decarbonization strategy for its steel and aluminum sectors. Not in reaction to the tariffs, but in response to where the world was already headed. Because while America tried to protect the past, Canada was investing in the future. Canadian producers moved fast. They cleaned up operations, retooled plants, and started producing low-emission metals using hydropower. These weren't just cleaner, they were compliant. Compliant with Europe's new CBAM regulations. Compliant with environmental standards that were quickly becoming global trade prerequisites. Compliant with the direction every major market was moving toward. And that's where Canada found its edge. Because in the new economy, sustainability isn't a bonus, it's the baseline. European buyers are no longer asking, who's the cheapest? They're asking, who's the cleanest? And Canada, without drawing attention to itself, had positioned its metal sector to answer that question perfectly. So while the US locked itself into a self-induced supply crisis, Canada opened new doors. Europe, Asia, emerging markets, they were all looking for low-carbon, stable suppliers. And there was Canada, ready to go. That's how you turn disruption into dominance. And let's be clear, this wasn't just some lucky accident. Canada didn't stumble into this. They engineered it. They understood that tariffs are short-term politics, but infrastructure and standards are long-term leverage. They set quotas. They tightened origin rules. They restricted cheap imports from high-emission countries. They reinforced their domestic market while expanding their global reach. It was measured. It was strategic. And it worked. The result? A new role for Canada, not as a junior partner in North American manufacturing, but as a leader in the next generation of industrial policy. And it's happening quietly, behind the noise of America's internal debates about who to tax, who to blame, and who to protect. What makes this shift so important is that it's not just about steel or aluminum. It's about how countries handle change. The US saw a challenge and responded with walls. Canada saw the same challenge and responded with windows opening up to where the market was going, not where it had been. And in doing so, they created an advantage rooted not in price, but in principle. That's what trade looks like now. Environmental credibility is currency. Compliance is access. And whoever adapts fastest sets the rules. Which raises a harsh question. Is the US keeping up? Because the numbers don't lie. Layoffs in steel-reliant towns. Rising costs for American manufacturers. A shrinking share of green-compliant exports. And all while Canada is securing contracts, diversifying markets, and building a metal industry that checks every box for the future of trade. And yes, it's still a work in progress. Canada isn't immune to the pain. 500,000 jobs remain linked to cross-border steel and aluminum flows. Disruptions hurt, but the difference is in the direction. While the US is stuck reacting to the fallout of its own policies, Canada is moving forward with a plan. They're building industrial resilience, not just protecting industrial pride. This is the turning point. Because now, the global economy isn't just asking about emissions and prices, it's asking about strategy, about credibility, about who's prepared. And Canada is showing up with answers. From infrastructure upgrades to procurement policies that reward low-carbon products, Canada's building something long-term. Their metals aren't just commodities, they're credentials. They open doors. They grant access. They make Canada a partner in high-standard global trade, not just a vendor. Meanwhile, America's industrial policy is facing a reckoning. Tariffs were supposed to be a reset button. Instead, they expose the cracks, a fragile supply chain, overdependence on imports, and a domestic industry unprepared for the standards of tomorrow. This isn't about blame. It's about direction. The question now is whether the US learns from this, whether it recognizes that protection without adaptation is just delay. That industrial strength isn't measured in tariffs, but in trust, in standards, in systems that actually work when the pressure hits. And right now, the country quietly demonstrating how to build that kind of system. It's Canada. If you've been watching the story unfold and wondering what's really happening, this is it. This isn't a side effect of tariffs. It's the result of choices, of what happens when one country doubles down on fear and the other bets on the future. Because this isn't just about metals. This is about who leads when the world changes. And make no mistake, the world is changing. Global markets are moving towards sustainability. Buyers are raising standards. Countries are aligning policy with carbon goals. And the next generation of industrial power will belong to those who show up ready. Canada saw that. Canada moved. The US still can. But it won't happen by accident. What makes this whole shift even more striking is how it unfolded with barely any attention. While US politicians argued on cable news about protecting American jobs and bringing steel back home, Canada was working quietly, methodically under the radar. No slogans, no drama, just strategy. And in today's economy, strategy wins. Because here's the truth. The market doesn't care about sentiment. It cares about supply, cost, standards, and sustainability. And on those fronts, the US isn't leading. The steel and aluminum tariffs were supposed to be a lifeline, but they turned into a chokehold. Not on foreign producers, but on American manufacturers themselves. The irony is brutal. The US tried to box out Canada, and in doing so, it gave Canada exactly what it needed: a reason to diversify, to innovate, and to align with markets that don't rely on Washington's approval. That's not just survival, that's evolution. And while American industries are still trying to figure out how to navigate inflated input prices and tariff-induced bottlenecks, Canada has opened new trade lanes, signed deals with markets that prioritize low-carbon standards, and built an export base that wants what Canada is producing. This is more than just a shift in where metal is coming from. This is a reset of why certain metals are in demand. Because low carbon is no longer optional. It's the price of entry. Countries that can't meet emissions benchmarks are already seeing penalties, barriers, and lost contracts. Meanwhile, Canada's hydro-powered, cleaner production methods aren't just checking boxes, they're turning into pricing advantages. Buyers are paying more for Canadian steel and aluminum, not because it's patriotic, because it's future-proof. And that has consequences. The US now finds itself in an uncomfortable position, trapped between the desire to protect its legacy industries and the growing need to adapt them to global expectations. And while that debate drags on, Canada's already moved on. The real story here isn't just about who sells more steel, it's about who understood the moment. The tariffs created chaos. Canada turned that chaos into clarity. While the US doubled down on protection, Canada invested in reinvention. And now, one country is stuck managing crisis after crisis, while the other is building new opportunity. That's what makes this shift so defining. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's real, and it's happening. So what happens next? The US still has time. Time to invest in cleaner technologies. Time to align with partners instead of punishing them. Time to move past reactionary policies and start playing the long game again. But that window is closing. Because while American policymakers debate, the rest of the world is moving fast. Standards are rising, markets are tightening, and the buyers of tomorrow are already choosing their suppliers based on emissions, transparency, and resilience, not price tags alone. Canada saw this coming, and now they're positioned, not just as a regional supplier, but as a global leader in sustainable metals. So the question isn't whether Canada is catching up. The question is whether America is falling behind. If you've been following this story and wondering why the metal market feels like it's flipped, this is why. It's not just economics, it's direction. And in that race, Canada's not just running, they're pacing the future. Hit like if this helped connect the dots. Share it. If someone you know still thinks tariffs are always the answer, subscribe if you want more sharp, no-spin breakdowns of how policy shapes the real world. And drop a comment, do you think the US can adapt in time, or has Canada already redefined the game? Because when the world changes, the leaders are the ones who saw it coming. And right now, Canada saw it first.